Welcome to the Beasley Curtis Auditorium at Memorial Hall. Please take a moment to identify the nearest exits. We also ask that you switch off and put away all electronic devices, as light from the devices is distracting to the artists and your fellow patrons. Recording and photography of any kind are strictly prohibited. As per university requirements, masks must be worn covering your nose and mouth at all times inside the venue. There is no intermission at this performance. Thank you and enjoy the show.
Yes, great. It's wonderful to see you all this Friday afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the spring iteration of our Philosophy in 15 Minutes event. My name is Michael Vazquez. I teach in the philosophy department. I also direct the outreach program that's in the philosophy department and at the Parr Center for Ethics. A big part of my job is sort of bringing philosophy out into the community and having conversations about life's big questions with K-12 students, older adults, incarcerated individuals, folks from all walks of life. So I can confidently say that even if you're new to philosophy, maybe you've never heard of it, maybe you've never taken a course, this subject has something to offer you. And that's what today's about. Luckily, here at Carolina, we have a very active philosophy department. And today's event is just kind of a glimpse into all the kind of goings-on, the programs, opportunities, and ideas that that department has to offer. So that includes not only courses and majors and minors, but also extracurricular programs, clubs, and fellowships. So you'll hear about two other programs that are housed in the philosophy department: the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, or PPE, and the Parr Center for Ethics. So PPE is an interdisciplinary program directed by Professor Jeff Sayre-McCord, who's here with us today. You'll hear more about the minor that they offer. They also offer lectures, undergraduate reading groups, and other programs that combine the kind of unique expertise of the three different disciplines that make it up. So I think PPE is a really good example of the way that philosophy can inform and be informed by other disciplines here at Carolina. And then there's the Parr Center for Ethics. That's the public face of Carolina's commitment to ethics. It's directed by Professor Sarah Stroud. The Parr Center offers an undergraduate fellows program, that's something you'll hear about more today, an outreach program, and a public philosophy program that reaches K-12 students across the country, known as the National High School Ethics Bowl. Okay, so that's the plan for today. Here's what we have lined up. We've got 3 15-minute presentations and 3 shorter talks about undergraduate opportunities in the department. Our 15-minute speakers will give you a sense for the kinds of questions that philosophers take up and the way in which they try to answer them. And our 3 shorter presentations will give you a closer look at some of the undergraduate opportunities that are available in the department through PPE and at the Parr Center. And at the end of the program, we'll gather outside over refreshments to continue the conversation, so please stick around, please introduce yourself, and feel free to ask questions of our presenters. So let's get started, get right into it then. Our first speaker is going to be Professor Lucy Schwarz. Lucy teaches in the philosophy department. She's also a member of the PPE faculty. Her work focuses on ethics, including questions about the foundations of morality, and also applied questions about the moral status of animals. Lately, she's even thinking about the aesthetics of horror movies. Today, she's going to be talking to us about the meaninglessness of life. Join me in welcoming Professor Lucy Schwarz.
All right. Yeah, What If Nothing Matters is the title of my short presentation. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about in the next 15 minutes. And I will try to convince you that if nothing matters, that presents us with a certain practical challenge. And then I will say a few things about how we can maybe address that challenge. So first, what do I mean when I say nothing matters? I mean that if nothing matters, there is nothing we objectively should or shouldn't do Nothing is objectively good or bad, and there are no real reasons to do or not do anything. A metaphorical way to think about this is that the universe doesn't care what you do. We're little specks of dust floating around in a vast, cold, empty place that doesn't care about what we humans do on our little planet over here. It doesn't matter how you live and what you do on a day-to-day basis. Now, a lot of people find that prospect pretty depressing. They want their lives to have meaning. They want their actions to matter. And they want to do things that really are valuable and good. And that's one problem. But that's not the main thing I want to focus on today, that it's sort of depressing if nothing matters. A less recognized issue is that if nothing matters, it sort of presents a kind of practical problem for how to live our lives and what to do on a day-to-day basis if it's all the same from the perspective of the universe. This problem arises because as humans, we are creatures who have to make decisions. That's why the problem arises in the first place. And when I say we have to make decisions, I don't mean in a moral sense, like that we have an obligation to make decisions. I mean in a psychological sense, that we literally cannot not make decisions. Whenever it occurs to you that you could do one thing or another thing instead, that there are different courses of actions open to you, you have to make a decision about what to do. You literally cannot go on unless you make that decision. Unlike some other animals, as humans, we aren't driven just by instinct. We aren't pushed around by our desires. We don't just automatically do things. Rather, we involuntarily reflect on what to do. And this isn't something we can just turn off. For example, just to illustrate the mundaneness of the point that I'm making here. In the morning, when your alarm rings and you realize that in order to get to work or school on time, you would now have to get up and leave your bed, but at the same time, you know, it would feel much better to stay in bed and not get up, so you're sort of pulled in different directions. You already have to make a decision about whether to get out of bed or to stay in bed. When you go to the kitchen and then it occurs to you that you could have either cereal or toast for breakfast, you need to make another decision about whether to get cereal or toast. You don't just automatically get the cereal or toast. You cannot just lean back and observe yourself acting. You have to actually choose the action. And later in the day, when a friend calls you and asks you for a favor, and you feel a pull towards helping out your friend, but you also feel a pull towards saying no, because that would be much more convenient. Again, you have to make a decision about which of these pulls to give in to. And again, this isn't something you can just shut off. As humans, we cannot run on autopilot. That's just not how our minds work. We have to actively make choices all the time. Now, you might think that you can get out of this necessity of making decisions by just staying seated in your chair right now forever. But that would itself be a decision. And in fact, every time it occurs to you that you could stand up from your seat, and then you still remain seated, that's another decision. So even by just sitting on your seat forever, you cannot get out of the necessity of making decisions. All right, so now we have that. We are decision-making creatures. And in those moments when it occurs to us that we have different courses of action open to us, we usually wonder, what should I do? Even if just for a brief moment. Like, often we don't linger on that question. Like when I wonder whether to get toast or cereal, I don't spend minutes reflecting on the question. But at least for a brief moment, I will think about, well, which of these should I pick? However, if nothing matters, then this question has no answer. There is nothing you should or shouldn't do. There are no reasons to do or not do anything. Getting out of bed and going to work is no better or worse than staying in bed. Toast is no better or worse than cereal. Helping your friend is no better or worse than not helping your friend. So what now? How can you make that decision if it doesn't matter at all what you do? It seems that if nothing matters, in an important sense, we lack guidance for what to do in our lives, both long-term and short-term. Some philosophers have found this idea pretty troubling, most notably the existentialists, whom you might have heard of, thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre or Albert Camus. Other philosophers, however, have been completely unimpressed by the idea that nothing objectively matters. And they respond, so what? Maybe nothing matters objectively from the perspective of the cosmos, but who cares? That's not a problem. What's crucial is that things matter to people. Things matter to us. We are valuing creatures. We prefer some things over others. We care about things. We have ideals. We have projects that we want to pursue, etc. So why would we need some external guide, some objective guide for how to live and act when we have desires and values within ourselves? So when you wonder what to do, just do the thing that's in line with your values and desires. Problem solved. And maybe that's a good response. On the one hand, I think it is, and on the other hand, I think it isn't. So let me explain to you in turn why I think it is and why I think it isn't. I think it's a good answer insofar as it's right that it's possible to use our desires, values, and preferences that we find ourselves with as a guide for what to do and how to live in the absence of an objective external guide. So in a way, our subjective values and preferences make it such that we're not completely lost without a compass just because there are no objective values, obligations, and reasons. So for example, one thing about myself is that I want to have money, I desire to have money in order to buy food and clothes and so forth, and in order to get the money, I have to get out of bed in the morning and go to work, and so maybe on that basis I could conclude that the answer to what should I do in the example of my alarm ringing is getting out of bed so that I can go to work and get money so that I can buy food and clothing. On the other hand, I find something to be very unsatisfying about this response to the idea that nothing matters. And here's why. The desires and values that we find ourselves with are totally contingent. They are the product of our upbringing and our genetics, and those things could just as well have been different, such that we would have ended up with completely different values, preferences, and desires. And those values and desires would have been no better or worse than the ones we actually happen to have. If there are no objective reasons for or against anything, then nothing justifies or grounds the specific desires or values that I happen to have. Maybe the actual version of myself desires to have friends or eat tasty food or to be a philosopher, but if these things aren't objectively valuable, it seems ultimately arbitrary that I value them. I could just have valued and pursued other things, and it wouldn't have mattered either way. So, why should I act on my values and desires rather than do something else, if it's ultimately arbitrary? Of course, if I act against my own values and desires, I will be miserable. I'll admit that much. But if nothing matters, that doesn't matter either, that I'm miserable. There is no objective reason for me to try to be happy rather than miserable. Or why not try to condition myself to value and desire other things from the ones I actually value and desire? That way I won't even be miserable. I'll just pursue other things. The bottom line is that while the philosophers who are unimpressed by the idea that nothing matters are right, that we can use our own desires and values as a guide when we have to decide what to do, what they fail to acknowledge, in my view, is that that would still be ultimately arbitrary, that there isn't actually any justification for doing so if nothing matters. And I think that makes it at least somewhat psychologically difficult to use our own desires and values as a guide for how to live, because you'll always have that little voice in the back of your head that knows that your own values and desires are ultimately arbitrary. So, where does that leave us? There are a few ways in which we might respond to all this stuff that I have said so far. The best case scenario is that things do actually objectively matter. In that case, we don't have to worry about the question, what if nothing matters? And philosophers have made forceful arguments to the effect that there are objective values and reasons and obligations. And even outside of philosophy, in the field of religion, there have, of course, also been arguments to the effect that things do objectively matter. So, if you are in this camp and you find those arguments convincing, then you are golden. You don't have to worry about the question, what if nothing matters? Alternatively, maybe you aren't convinced by the philosophical and religious arguments to the effect that things do objectively matter. But nevertheless, you tell yourself, I just have to assume that things objectively matter. Because otherwise, how could you even go on living? That's just no way to live. I have to assume that things objectively matter. That is a necessity for me to go on with my life. That would be another response. Or, if that doesn't appeal to you, you could just radically embrace the arbitrariness of everything you do. And that is, in a way, what the existentialists end up doing, who I mentioned earlier. You accept that there are no ultimate grounds for anything you do, that it's all just your choice, you exerting your will on the world without justification, and you just sort of roll with that. That would be another way to respond to the problem I just laid out. And now I'm pretty much at the end of my presentation. And in closing, I just want to emphasize one more thing that I find pretty important after all is said and done. Somehow, so I just laid out 3 possible responses to this problem of what if nothing matters. But somehow a lot of people seem to think that the most logical response to the belief that nothing matters is to become reclusive, gloomy, and self-destructive. And that is why I find it very important to point out that that doesn't follow at all from the view that nothing matters. If it doesn't matter what you do, if there are no reasons for you to do or not do anything, then you have no more reasons to withdraw from the world and ruin your health and future and be miserable than you have to participate in social life, take care of yourself, and be happy. That choice is completely up to you, if nothing matters.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Okay, so up next we have Andrea Vulcan. Andrea is going to tell us a little bit more about all the things PPE has to offer undergraduates at Carolina. Andrea is a student in PPE and a member of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics Society. Join us in welcoming Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Let me just lower this a little bit. Yeah, I'm very glad to be here. And Professor, I hope this presentation objectively matters. As Michael said, my name is Andrea. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a senior at UNC studying sociology and political science. But that's not why we're here, right? I'm also a PPE minor. And the PPE minor involves 3 different disciplines, as Michael was explaining: philosophy, politics, and economics. For students, what this means is that they will have to take a class within each of these fields, one class in philosophy, one in political science, and one in economy, including a gateway class and the capstone course, which was my favorite personally. Now, that's not all. From my experience with this minor, it's much more than taking classes. It's really about immersing yourself in the world of PPE and finding your own niche. From reading groups to the PPE club called the PPE Society, which we will hear more about in a few moments, to events with keynote speakers, and even having lunch with professors. Your experience can be unique and tailored to your own interest within the three fields of philosophy, politics, and economics. I remember joining a PPE group where we read a book, The Cost-Benefit Revolution by Cass Sunstein. Well, one of his many, many books. Picture piles of books. And what I learned in that reading group was that you can't take everything you hear at face value. You have to question it. You have to understand what its true meaning is. And that unlocks what I call the PPE mindset. And I think that's really the goal of the PPE minor, for students to go above and beyond the classroom and truly, like I said earlier, immerse yourself in the world of PPE and find your own understanding of what it means. I actually joined this same event, a few years ago, and I remember being completely enraptured by all of the presentations. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen, even though there was a buffet right next to me. Yeah, Aristotle was just all I could think about. And I'm just truly humbled to be here today speaking in front of you about something I'm very passionate about. Now, one last thing I want to talk about is the professors within the PPE department. I have to say they are some of the kindest and most knowledgeable people, as you have seen with Professor Bovens and Professor Sayer McCord, who's actually the director of the PPE department. They are just so nice and friendly and approachable, and I would recommend anyone to join the PPE department. I would even take my classes all over again. And as the capstone professor that I had, Kieran Sinkerin, said last semester, nerd, but sometimes that's what you are. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for that wonderful presentation. So moving on from the PPE mindset, we will take up the Parr Center mindset. Our next two presenters are Kenzie Novak and Samad Rangoonwala. These are Parr Fellows. They're Ethics Fellows at the Parr Center for Ethics. They're going to tell us a little bit about Parr Heals programming. Let's welcome them.
Hello, my name is Kenzie Novak.
My name is Samad Rangoonwala,
I'm a Global Studies and Philosophy double major,
and I am a Public Policy and Philosophy double major.
and we are very happy to be here today to tell you about the Parr Center and the various programs and ways to get involved with the Parr Center. First, we're going to talk about the Ethics Recruits program, and this is for any student who is new to ethics or just wants to get involved extremely quickly. This is a new program. It's only been here for a year. It's the first year. And the only thing you have to do is attend 2 Parr Center lectures, twice monthly student-focused meetings, and optional weekly discussions. And this is also a way to dip your toes into another program that Samad and I are both involved in that I'll let him talk about.
Right, so the Ethics Fellows program is for people who might have a little bit more experience with ethics already. Maybe they did debate in high school, ethics bowl, something of that sort. People who want to get a little bit more involved, and this does have an application process, so every fall there is an application. You're going to sit through an interview, and the students who are selected are going to work in groups. Those are called pods, and an ethics-related project for the entire year. I'm in the Chapel Phil pod. We make a podcast. It's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all your little podcasting apps that you want to. We call ourselves the podcast for the ethically curious UNC student. So we take a look at various ethical issues that are affecting the UNC campus. We put out an episode earlier this semester about the UNC budget cuts to the library system, whether or not that was the ethical thing for UNC to do. some of the issues that arise as a result of a university cutting its library budget. We're putting out another one very soon about UNC's COVID response and like analyzing it through a couple of different lenses, through a collectivist response and individualist response. And then there's going to be another one coming out soon after that about the mental health crisis on campus and how UNC and the student body should respond to it. So that's just a little bit about how Chapel Phil operates. We're looking into a lot of different ethical issues and putting it out there for people.
And then the pod that I am in is Ethics from My Seat, or EMS, and this is a pod that focuses on weekly discussions that is student-based entirely, and we just talk about various ethical topics, changing week to week. And this is also where the ethics recruits will join us, and it is an extremely lively discussion, and it depends entirely on students' collaboration, and it can get pretty intense. It's basically just a place to argue about your opinions and your ethical beliefs. And finally, the last program are the Ethics Scholars. And this is a designation which is for students who serve as fellows for 2 years, take approved ethics courses, participate in a skills learning course, and complete a final reflection. And it sounds like a lot, but it's over the course of 4 years. And it sounds very intelligent also.
Yeah. And if you fulfill all the requirements, you're going to receive university recognition and a little mark on your transcript so you can brag to all of your future employers about how you are an ethics scholar.
And I cannot stress enough how much the Parr Center has impacted me already. I'm also a work study student, so I've gotten to work with a lot of different people in the Parr Center, and I've truly met some of my best friends, including Samad. We've done it together, and it's just an amazing community, and you can meet amazing people. So you can apply now. You can go to the website. It was up here earlier, but you can apply for all of them, and they're all very simple, very easy application processes, and I would encourage all of you to get involved if you have any interest in ethics whatsoever.
A little side note, for an incentive, there is free coffee in the Parr Center pretty much at all times, so, you know.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Kenzie and Samad. Up next, we have Karl Adams. So Karl's a PhD candidate in the philosophy department. He works on a variety of different normative issues and questions. So that is questions about how you should lead your life as an individual or how we should arrange ourselves kind of socially and politically. His work draws on diverse traditions in philosophy, including, for example, Chinese philosophy and Africana philosophy. Today, he's going to talk to us about some arguments for open borders and settler colonialism. So join me in welcoming Karl.
Lucy gave us a very nice tradition. All right. Thank you all. So, as Michael helpfully said, I'm going to talk about open borders and arguments for open borders and how they relate to the history of settler colonialism. So, open borders is a position in the philosophy of migration. It's sort of also migrated into the kind of ordinary talk in politics. Sometimes it's a thing that a lot of people advocate. It's probably the most popular view in philosophy of migration. If not, it's almost. And it's also become something that people with certain kinds of political perspectives tend to criticize, right? And there's this sort of like, oh, you want open borders, that's a bad thing. So what is this? So the way that people in philosophy of migration talk about open borders, what they mean is basically that the borders between countries will become roughly like the borders between, say, North Carolina and South Carolina, right? They're still going to be there. They're going to matter for things like who you pay taxes to, who you can vote for, which laws you have to follow, but anybody can cross them and live wherever they want in the world, right? So this, of course, is a pretty radical change to the way that the world is arranged now. And then, of course, the question is, well, why? And there's some what seem like pretty powerful arguments for this, and I'm going to talk about three families of these kinds of arguments based on freedom, equality, and utility. So the freedom-based ones go something like this. So Joseph Cairns points out that it's not just that there are borders, right? But the borders have guards, and the guards have guns. So this isn't just, oh, we have a border and we have a policy about who can cross it. No, there's coercion that's going on here, right? There's people that will shoot you if you try to cross the border. And then the idea is, well, that is a restriction of people's freedom to go where they want to go, and that has to be justified somehow, right? And so the burden of proof is on people who want to say that, some state has the right to shoot you if you try to cross its border. And then people build on that further and say two things. So one, well, when you have coercion like this, you can have it in your own state all the time, so there are places that we can't go, right? So like, you need a permit to enter a national park, or you can't go in my house without my permission, right? But those are justified because we exist under democratic laws, and so people will say, the people on the other side of the border don't get to vote, right? They don't get to be part of the decision-making that makes these rules in the way that the restrictions on movement within the country are legitimate because of that buy-in. And the other thing that people will say is that we have this idea that freedom of movement is important. It's recognized as a human right in the human rights documents, and we think that a state that says, no, you have to stay in your village, right, is a horrible, oppressive thing. And then they'll say, well, all of the reasons you have for caring about not being ordered that you have to stay in your village apply to not being told by all of the other states that don't want to let you in, you have to stay in your state, right? So that's the freedom-based kinds of arguments. Then there is the egalitarian ones based on equality. So Cairns, again, argues that our system where how your life goes depends radically on where you're born is basically like the feudal system in Europe, right? So in the same way that back in the day, if you have a good life, largely depends on if you're born, in the manor house to the lord, or if you're born in the village to the peasant. Today, whether you get decent medical care, whether you live in a place where there's a prevailing wage that you can live on, right? As opposed to living on less than $1 a day, which about a third of the world's population do. That just depends on where you're born, right? And that's a kind of inequality that's unjust. It's a lack of equal opportunity. And that's created by the system where you have some states where there's prosperous people, keep everyone else out, right? In the same way that the Lord says, no, this is my manor house. You can't come here. You stay in the village and you work for me, right? So that's the kind of egalitarian argument. And also, people will supplement it by talking about resources. So there are some states that get a hugely disproportionate share of the world's resources. The US, for instance, has uses about 20% of the world's resources and has about 5% of the world's population. People will say, this is unfair. You're using more than your fair share. And then utility. So this is a fancy philosophy and economics word for like the best consequences for everybody. And so this is an argument that's most put forward by economists, and they'll say, so for the same reasons that, and this is free market economists who make this argument, they want free trade of goods because then they'll be produced in the place where it's most efficient, and that will lead to more prosperity for everybody, they say. The same applies to workers, right? So if you have free movement, anybody can move where they want. Workers will go where the jobs are. All of the employers have to compete for workers globally, and all of the potential employees have to compete for jobs with everyone else in the world. And so this will mean that labor use is maximally efficient, right? People will go and work where their skills and talents are most productive because that's where they'll be paid most. And so therefore you have best usage of everybody's talents in the world, right? So these are our three families of arguments. And the thing that a lot of my research, and this is sort of at the core of my dissertation, is based on is that this all sounds pretty good if you think about just the context that these are designed for, right? When people make these open borders arguments, they're thinking about the US immigration policy now. But if you think about the history of philosophy, and a lot of people who make these arguments sort of don't, you notice, or at least I noticed, that these three types of arguments are parallel to arguments that were historically made to justify settler colonialism. So settler colonialism, by that I mean the kind of colonialism where you have people show up in a country, oftentimes ordinary people just wanting a better life, and then at some point they take over, right? You either take power from the people that were living there and end up setting up an oppressive system or driving them out. This is what happened in the US and many other countries, and is happening today in places like the Amazon, Southeast Asia, in China, in Tibet, and Xinjiang. And so if we want to say that's bad and wrong, and we have arguments that lead to the idea that that's good and just and morally required to be allowed, we have a problem. And so here's why. I'll go through just really quickly the three types of arguments again in the historical form. So liberty. People like Francisco de Vitoria and Hugo Grotius, great 16th century natural lawyers, 15th and 16th century scholars in international law, made arguments like this. Well, how do we get things like property? Well, in the state of nature, before there was a society, people would have agreed to set up property and to set up governments, to do all of these things. It's better for everybody. It protects people's rights, and so on and so forth. And then how did they do that? Well, there is a sort of a presumption that you're free to do things that don't harm other people or aren't, directly, and you're free to do things that haven't been forbidden by some kind of authority, and there are limits on what an authority, what a government can tell you to do. And one of those limits that Grotius and Vittoria put on is that they have to let you come and settle. And they made the same kind of argument that I mentioned earlier about jurisdiction. So Vittoria says, look, there's a choice. Either the Spanish wanting to go to, say, Mexico or what now is Mexico, then the Aztec Empire, either they're subject to the laws of the Aztec Empire or they're not. If they're not, it's illegitimate for the Aztec Empire to tell them not to come because they're not subject to those laws. And if they are, it's illegitimate for the Aztec Empire to tell people that are subject to its laws that they can't live in their state. Equality. So many people made these kinds of arguments. I think one of the clearest is by Emir de Fattel. And so he argued that, much as I said earlier, there's something like fair shares of resources. And so if the world's population is small enough that everybody can use enough land to live as a hunter-gatherer, then that's great. But once there's enough people that that's not possible anymore, then some groups of people can't use enough land to be hunter-gatherers when that forces other people to crowd together and become farmers, which is harder work, right? And if you think about American Indian societies, they had often much higher standards of living if you look at things like infant mortality and nutrition than European peasants did. And that was significantly because of lower population densities and better environmental stewardship. So the idea is, Fattel says, it's unfair for American Indian societies to tell settlers they can't come settle there because they're using more than their share of land. And that's this sort of inequality concern. And then as for utility, I'll mention John Locke. So this is embedded in a much bigger argument, but the short version is he thinks, look, there's inefficient usage of natural resources. If you have European settlers come and settle, they will be able to produce more from the same amount of land. So we saw that the utilitarian argument about maximizing utility, producing the best consequences, nowadays is sort of general, right? Like, whatever your job is, you're going to move to the best job. This is how we get the efficient distribution of workers to jobs. And in Locke's day, of course, one of the main jobs is agriculture, and so he has a more specific thing. No. We need the most efficient distribution of potential farmers to land. So, where do we go from here? The people defending open borders will all happily say that the arguments they've given might need to be qualified. So they count in favor of open borders, but maybe there are things that count against it. And then what they do is they try to knock down all those arguments. I don't have time to talk about all of that now. But I think what we need to conclude from this is that one of those things that justifies immigration restrictions sometimes, at least in these cases of settler colonialism, if we want to say, right, it was justified for, say, American Indian nations to try to keep out European settlers, there's got to be some kind of justification. There's got to be a qualification more than what the open borders people want to give us. And then the question is, well, how far does that extend? I have a sort of version of this that I argue for, and I think it aligns with a lot of what the open borders people want when you think about the US context and not in the other context. But whatever the sort of positive story is, there's got to be one. What else can we conclude from these kinds of parallels? Well, I think one thing is that it's important to pay attention to history. So both the history of like how societies have been different in the past and what we think about trying to apply our principles to those societies. Because if they don't work, then maybe they're bad principles. Or maybe they need to be qualified, right? And also the history of thought. The history of what philosophers and other kinds of scholars have thought in the past matters for what we think now because we notice these kinds of parallels, right? And we say, this kind of argument has been made by other people for other purposes in the past. Are we okay with those conclusions? And if not, how do we qualify this, or how do we modify this, or what do we do that leads us not to adopt a thing that says things like settler colonialism was justified, or attempts by indigenous peoples today to control their land are wrong because we need to have open borders and everyone can live wherever they want. So that is my takeaway, and thank you for listening to the talk.
Okay, thanks so much, Karl. So next up, we have another presentation about an undergraduate opportunity. In this case, it's Nathan Harrison and Lauren Haynes. I believe will be talking to us about the Undergraduate Philosophy Club, another way to get involved, both thinking about undergraduate opportunities, but also a kind of group to share postgraduate thinking with. So let's welcome Nathan and Lauren.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having us up here. I guess just to start, I'm Nathan Harrison. I'm a junior here. I'm a philosophy and economics double major.
And I'm Lauren Haynes. I'm a major in public policy with a minor in politics, philosophy, and economics.
So Lauren and I are both active members of the philosophy club here. I'm one of the current VPs, and the two of us also make up the current executive team for this year's edition of Aperto Nemo, which is UNC's peer-reviewed undergraduate journal of philosophy. I'll be serving as editor-in-chief for this coming year, and Lauren will be our senior editor. So, unsurprisingly, these are the exact topics we came to speak about this afternoon. So, as I mentioned before, Aperto Nemo is UNC's undergrad philosophy journal. We're currently accepting submissions for the 2022 edition, and we will continue to do so until March 31st. So if you're at all interested, please send in your best work, of course. Guidelines on submitting can be found on our submission portal, which was emailed out to all of the philosophy majors and hopefully the PPE minors soon as well. But if you have any trouble finding it, please just reach out to either one of us or Dr. Marcus Cole if you have trouble finding us as well. So I'll go ahead and let Lauren introduce the Philosophy Club now.
All right, thank you, Nathan. So, hello everyone for being here today. I want to invite you all to join us at UNC's Undergraduate Philosophy Club. We meet weekly on Wednesdays from 7 to 8 p.m. in Caldwell 213, which is on the second floor of the Philosophy Building. Our meetings usually begin with a short student presentation introducing the week's topic, either by us or one of the other members, and this topic is also student chosen. The rest of the meeting is an open discussion between members, often centered around discussion questions that the leader of that presentation week provides. This semester, some of our few topics have been love, hope and despair, and comedy, and these are the kinds of things that we talk about and discuss in our meetings. We try to keep our doors open. Many of our members aren't philosophy majors. For example, I'm a public policy major, and in other words, there's no expectation that you are a member of the philosophy department. We emphasize diverse perspectives and are absolutely looking for a variety of viewpoints in our meetings. There's also no expectation that you know a lot of theory. You don't need to be able to quote Kant's third critique verbatim in order for us to accept your opinion. We do require that you know his second critique, though. We'll have you recite that. Just kidding. But all jokes aside, if you want to come join us for our weekly discussions, please do. We've got a great group of students who are always looking for more, and they're very fun discussions. And we always have free pizza.
So as I always say, come to Philosophy Club for the food, but stay to contemplate the nature of the good. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren and Nathan. So before I introduce our last speaker, before we move outside for refreshments, I do want to mention one other departmental opportunity that you can find information about online, and that is the Lesher Fund. So if you are an undergraduate engaged in any form of study of philosophy, you don't need to be a major, you are eligible to apply for funds that would allow you to maybe attend a conference or to pursue some form of scholarship or creative activity relating to the study of philosophy. That's the Lesher Fund. As a department, would be eager to see your applications and to see your interest. Let us know if you have any questions about that. And without further ado, our last speaker is not only in charge of the Lesher Fund, but is in charge of the department as a whole. This is Professor Matthew Kotzen. Matt works on epistemology, the philosophy of science, and the nature of evidence in law. He also thinks about the philosophical dimensions of comedy. So for those of you who are able to join us, the Parr Center recently had an event with American Study Professor Michelle Robinson in conversation with Matt Kotzen about the ethics of comedy. And today, he'll be giving us a 15-minute presentation, so join me in welcoming Professor Matt Kotzen.
Told I can take my mask off behind the yellow zone, so that's what I'm doing. Thank you to Michael and to all of the presenters today. Mindful of the time, I might try to do some philosophy in about 10 minutes, but we'll see how that goes. So I want to talk to you today about the NFL, the American federal judiciary, and our everyday practices of listening to other people's opinions. See how that goes. Let's start with the NFL. So you may have watched the Super Bowl, you may have watched some games in the NFL, maybe some of you didn't, but one thing that is notable about the NFL is that there's a system of review, there's a system of challenges, where one coach can challenge a call that was made on the field by a referee. Now, they can't challenge anything. There are only certain kinds of decisions that were made on the field that can be reviewed. Generally speaking, though this is a bit fuzzy, generally speaking, so-called judgment calls generally aren't reviewable. So a decision that a referee might make that is an exercise of his or her judgment generally is supposed to be something that isn't reviewed. So questions like that that are unreviewable through this system involve questions like whether a runner's forward progress was stopped before he went out of bounds, whether a runner gave himself up deliberately to down the ball, whether a quarterback was intentionally grounded the ball or not. These are all judgment calls that generally are not reviewable. But questions that are amenable to more straightforward, objective, factual inquiry, questions like whether a pass was caught, whether the runner achieved a first down before he was down, these are the sorts of things that generally can be reviewed. And an interesting and really important feature of this review is that it doesn't just work that a coach calls challenges the play, and then some other referee, some higher referee comes in and just substitute his or her own judgment for the first referee's about what had happened. So the conversation isn't just, what do we think happened? Let's look at the evidence and we'll just decide whatever we think happened. That's not how it works. The way that it works is that there's a very specific standard in place with regard to reviews of certain types of referee decisions, and that generally is the clear and obvious visual evidence standard. So when a referee is looking to review or decide whether to overturn a call that a lower referee has made, they're not asking the question, what would I have done? What would I have said? They're only asking the question, is there clear and obvious visual evidence sufficient to overturn this call? So even if the higher referee, the reviewing referee, were to determine, you know what, if I were on the field, I would have called it differently, that's not enough. They only review it if they think that there's this pretty high standard, clear and obvious visual evidence. That's what we tend to call a pretty deferential standard, a standard that isn't just substituting one person's judgment for another person's judgment, but is rather involves a kind of deference to another person's judgment, in this case, deference by the reviewing referee to the initial referee who called the particular play on the field. Now, why might we have this kind of a deferential standard in football or in other kinds of games? Well, there are a lot of reasons why we might have a deferential standard, but I'm going to focus on three. First one has to do with epistemology. It has to do with the epistemic position that each one of them are in. Right? So the referees who initially call the play, they're right down there on the field, they're running with the players, they seem to in some sense have the best vantage point. There's some sense of epistemic privilege that they have over the referee that's sitting hundreds of feet away up in a booth, in some cases hundreds of miles away in New York City, even if the game is in California. So there's some sense of epistemic privilege that we want to generally defer to the people who are in the best epistemic position to acquire the evidence and evaluate it. So that's one kind of reason. Another kind of reason has to do with respect. So there's a sense that, look, the referees have a job to do, the referees on the field, we entrust them with it, we pay them for it, we expect them to run up and down and exhaust themselves and do their job, and overruling them, saying that they were wrong, is something that we should only do under some fairly extreme circumstances. So the mere fact that some other guy sitting in New York disagrees with him, that's not enough. We want to have a kind of respect for the autonomy, for the authority of the original referees, and we want to defer to them, give them the opportunity to exercise that discretion and authority, unless something really bad happened, unless there's clear and obvious visual evidence sufficient to overturn it. A third kind of reason that we have for deferential standards involves something like administrative efficiency, right? We don't want to just spend the entire game reviewing every single thing that a referee called. It's going to be enormously boring for us at home to watch it. It's going to be a huge waste of time. It's going to diminish the entertainment value of the game, and it creates a kind of incentive for coaches to challenge over and over again, just in the hope that maybe one guy is going to disagree with the judgment of another guy. And we want that not generally to be the case. We want to create a kind of disincentive to engage in this challenging behavior, and that it's only if something really reaches a really high level of error that we're going to go ahead and overturn an original judgment. Now, in the federal judiciary, we have standards that look an awful lot like that. So the question isn't whether we should overturn the call that a referee made. The question is whether we should overturn a judgment that's typically made by a federal trial court judge. So a district court judge that is overseeing trials will reach certain findings of fact, sometimes as a result of a jury finding, sometimes not. And there's a question about under what circumstances those findings of fact or findings of law can be reviewed and overturned by a higher appellate court. In the federal judicial system, typically, though not always, those sorts of appeals are heard by a circuit court of appeals in the United States. Now, what has come to be known as sort of standard judicial review, not just in America, but in most countries that inherited their judicial system as we did from England, there's something that looks sort of like standard judicial review. And the standard sort of judicial review is that issues of fact, judge-found fact, get reviewed for what gets called clear error. Notice the similarity between that clear error standard and the clear and obvious visual evidence standard that is active in the NFL. So higher appellate courts can review findings of fact, and in some cases can overturn them, but it's a very demanding standard. It's only if the appellate court decides that the judge found fact was a clear instance of error will that be overturned. With regard to issues of law, if a federal district court judge finds something as a matter of law, interprets the law in a particular way, decides that some law is unconstitutional, makes some other finding of law, that is reviewed using a much, much less deferential standard. It's reviewed using what we call it the de novo standard, which means roughly that the appellate court is coming to the issue as though it were new. They're hearing it as though they were hearing it for the first time. That's what de novo means. Now, de novo review doesn't mean that the appellate judges won't listen to what the federal district court judge said. It doesn't mean that they're literally coming to this issue as though it's never been decided before. They'll read the trial court judge's opinion. They'll listen to what he or she had to say about it. But there's no deference that's given. The question is just whether the arguments persuade the appellate court judges or not. There's no deference that's given. They really are just giving their own opinion, their own judgment about the legal issue that's before them. There's no sense in a de novo review. It's not possible for, under a de novo review, for a higher court to say, well, you know, we would have called it one way, but we're going to kind of go with what the federal district court judge had to say, even though it's different from how we might have called it. There's a separate standard for exercises of discretion that gets called the abuse of discretion standard. That's also a very high and demanding standard. That's something like the clear and obvious visual evidence standard. I won't spend a lot of time dwelling on that for today. Now, I think a lot of the same types of considerations that apply in the sports case, in the NFL case, seem to apply in the judicial case as well. So there's some sense that with regard to findings of fact, it was the district court judge that is in the best epistemic position to find facts. He or she was right there, listening to the trial, hearing the arguments of the advocates. That person is in the best epistemic position to reach finding of fact. Whereas with questions of law, that's something that we can kind of settle from the armchair. It doesn't look as though the district court judge was in any better of an epistemic position with regard to deciding on the constitutionality of a law than is the appellate court judge. In fact, quite the opposite. In some sense, the appellate court judges often regard themselves to be more experienced, higher up the food chain, to know more about the law in some cases than federal district court judges. And so that epistemic standard that difference in epistemic position seems to explain why we apply these different standards to two different types of findings. There's also a sense that there's a respect for a certain kind of authority or position analogous to the one that we saw in the NFL case, right? We the appellate court judges respect what the federal district court judges do, respect the role that they're playing. They sat there in and out every day, listening to often lengthy testimony, lengthy jury selection. They're the ones who are right there on the field, much like the referees are in the NFL. And there's a respect for the kind of authority and judgment that those people offer, at least with regard to the management and the judgment that is exercised in a trial. Perhaps less so with regard to findings of law. And with regard to administrative efficiency, again, we see something that's pretty similar. We don't want every single district court finding to be appealed just in the hope that somebody in the circuit is going to see the situation a little bit differently than the federal district court judge. Why not take a risk? Hopefully somebody will find it differently. Now, with regard to questions of law, there is that kind of incentive, but we want to minimize that kind of incentive with regard to questions of fact and exercises of judgment of the district court judge, because we don't want to spend arbitrary amounts of resources, time, energy, and so forth, appealing every single finding that a party doesn't like on up through the chain, and so we want to create a kind of disincentive to do that. One of the things that I'm most interested in with regard to my research in the law is thinking about whether there are analogs of a lot of these legal rules and epistemic standards and principles that we see in formal legal context to our everyday lives. And I think that in this case there is perhaps some interesting analogy to the kinds of things that we do when we exercise a kind of review over decisions that other people make in our everyday lives. So quite a lot of our judgments, quite a lot of our decisions, quite a lot of our opinions are pretty heavily informed by what other people have to say, right? There's quite a lot of deference to experts, deference to others who have spent more time on a topic than I've spent. The vast majority of what I know through testimony of others. The vast majority of what I know about science and about history and about mathematics is stuff that I learned through listening to others. And so there's a question here about exactly what kinds of standards, what kind of deference I show to those kinds of people. It's quite natural, I think, to show people who know more than I do, who are in the details much more than I am, a certain kind of deference. Now, in a lot of cases, I think that translates, or that is motivated by a pretty clear sense in which they're in a better epistemic situation than I am. They've spent years getting PhDs in things that I won't ever get a PhD in, and investigating and spending time with and acquainting themselves with the data on whatever the topic is, virology or astrophysics or medicine or public policy or whatever it is. So generally speaking, with regard to facts, I think there's a highly deferential type of review. I might, if somebody says something totally crazy, or if someone says something that just is clearly erroneous, clearly inconsistent with my experience, I might exercise a kind of review over that and decide, you know what, I'm not going to go with the expert on this. But with regard to the vast majority of things that other people tell me, if they're in an epistemic situation that is superior to mine, then there's an inclination to kind of defer to them. I think there's also a sense in which there's a respect for their authority that is playing a role here. So it's not just that they happen to be epistemically better situated than I am, but I think that there's something that registers to a lot of us as profoundly disrespectful when experts tell us something they've spent their life learning about COVID, or learning about, well, you can't spend your life learning about COVID, but learning about virology, learning about some medical situation, learning about whatever the thing that they're an expert on is. And here I am just deciding that, well, I would have called it differently on the basis of what I read on Facebook. There seems to be not just an epistemic mistake that's being made there, but also a kind of mistake with regard to the respect that's owed to the authority of the individuals who I'm so easily dismissing on the basis of substitution of my own judgment for theirs. There's also a consideration about administrative efficiency here. I mean, I can't go around second-guessing everything that's said out there, and so I need to exercise, or if I'm going to get on with my life, if I'm going to get on with organizing my priorities and getting through the day, I'm going to need to defer to other people on quite a lot of things. But I also think that there are certain kinds of limits to that. And so a topic that's come up in a couple of different corners of philosophy over the last decade or so is that there are certain kinds of limits for substituting other people's judgment for their own. The two that have come up the most are ethics and aesthetics. It doesn't seem at all weird for me to say, well, you are an expert in virology, so if you say X, I'm going to just believe X because you seem to know quite a lot more than I do about it. Nor does it seem to be weird to say, well, you're an expert in nephrology or an expert in cardiology, and so I'm going to defer to you. But there seems to be something quite odd about deferring to other people with regard to questions in ethics and aesthetics. It seems somehow odd or strange or unusual for me to say something like, well, I believe that Macbeth was a beautiful play. I haven't read it. I haven't seen it performed, but my drama teacher says so, and so I'm going to believe it on the basis of her testimony. It similarly seems something a little bit odd with regard to at least some ethical questions. I don't really have any particular view myself about whether incest is wrong or about abortion is wrong, but my ethics professor told me that was the case. I saw it at an ethics lecture at the Parr Center, so that's what I believe. So there seems to be a sort of sense in which there are certain kinds of questions over which we exercise a very deferential kind of review, a very deferential review with regard to factual questions about science, about medicine, about empirically informed, objective matters. And there seems to be a sense in which we exercise de novo review, a much less kind of deferential review with regard to aesthetic questions, with regard to ethical questions, in my view, with regard to certain types of epistemological questions, and so forth. So that's where I'll leave it. As I said, the analogy at this point is merely suggestive. There's a lot more to say about the details of the incentives to engage in this different type of review for different types of questions in our everyday lives. But I think that there's quite a lot to be learned from thinking about how these standards play themselves out in more formal contexts like the law and NFL football and other places where there's a formal mechanism in place for higher authorities to review the lower authorities. And I think we can learn quite a lot by thinking about those principles and the incentives for those principles to be structured the way that they are. And I think that they can give us quite a lot of insight into the types of review, the types of rules that we follow when we listen to others and when we decide how much deference to give them. Thank you.
All right, so that brings us to a close. I'll just reiterate here to wrap us up that we are excited as a department to get you involved, especially in the post-COVID era that we hope is on the horizon or very near. We, it is no exaggeration, have something happening in Caldwell Hall every day, whether it's a PPE lecture, a Parr Center pod meeting, a seminar in session, or an outreach visit out to a school or a prison that's on the way out. We want you to get involved. Stick around, introduce yourself, ask us questions. Let's go enjoy some refreshments outside and close by thanking our speakers one more time. Thank you very much.